Thank you so much, and good evening, and another round of applause for Christina and Brian. I get to talk this evening about something that most of you probably have never thought about. And I have some things to tell you about the topic of magical Jews. It turns out that the intersection of Jewish culture and theatrical magic has a very deep and long history. And as soon as I get my notes to load, I'd like to tell you a bit about it. We can start almost anywhere, but I'll begin in 1910, specifically in December of that year, during a Christmas season in London, England. The city's variety theaters and music halls during that Christmas season featured no less than 31 different magicians. And of those, 5 were headliners. In other words, the stars of their various variety bills. Of those 5, all were American. And of those, 4 of them were Jews. The 5th was a Scottish-American masquerading as a Chinese, and that is the subject for a different lecture. It has been long known that for well over a century of Western history, the field of theatrical magic has contained a disproportionately large number of Jews, from Harry Houdini to David Copperfield. But no one has addressed what to me is the more interesting question, why? Until now. This is a montage of some of the most important and influential and popular magicians of the last 120-odd years. None of these people are in today's talk. They don't fit one half of the title equation. Instead, we'll move over to this. This is an article that was published in the New York Times on July 22nd, 1918, and it announces the start of an organization called Rabbi's Sons Theatrical Benevolent Association. And for those who can't read the small text, I'll point out the important stuff. The secretary of the organization was Irving Berlin. The vice president of the organization was Al Jolson. And the president was Harry Houdini. Now, I should mention that Houdini will not get a lot of attention from me this evening. He's had more than his share of attention in other talks, so he'll crop up once or twice, but this is not going to be a Houdini talk. The starting point for this talk is shown in this photograph. This is the entrance to the Skirball Cultural Center here in Los Angeles. Back in April of 2011, they had an exhibition entitled Masters of Illusion, Jewish Magicians of the Golden Age. They defined the Golden Age as being from about 1875 to 1948, somewhat arbitrary parameters. If you look carefully at the photograph, you'll see that at the very back end of the hallway, as you enter into this museum exhibition, there is an automaton, which is to say a mechanical man that moves by bewildering hidden mechanisms. This automaton was named Antonio Diavolo, named after a popular Italian acrobat at the time, a Gentile. And it was made by the great French magician, Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, a Gentile. And it was built around 1849. So you can see that those parameters of the Golden Age were dropped pretty quickly, as were the cultural issues about it being a Jewish exhibition. But most of it was. Today I'm going to talk about Jews specifically, so let's start with someone actually who fits that. This is a photograph of a poster, and the poster is from a fellow named Herbert Albini, who was born Abraham Lasky. One of the difficulties of this talk is that everybody changes their name, so sometimes you have to dig a bit deeper. He was born in Poland in 1860, raised in England, but moved to the United States in 1891. And by 1911, he was trouping in vaudeville theaters and the like with a show that involved 12 onstage assistants. So a big deal. To magicians, he's known for having probably invented the modern version of what is called the egg bag, a trick that many of you may have seen, where an egg is placed into a small bag and caused it to disappear and come back again. The trick is much older than Albini. It's probably about 1,000 years old. But Albini was the first one to do it with a small bag based on the size of a human hand. He also did it with a comedy approach, and he was probably the first to do that. And his significance in this talk is really because he gave lessons to this guy. This is Horace Goldin, born Hyman Goldstein in Vilna, Poland in 1873. His first exposure to magic was seeing a performance by a gypsy. He moved to the United States in the late 1880s, and in 1896 he debuted as a professional performer, and within 5 years he was a star. In 1913, the first magician to perform at the Palace Theater in New York, which was the biggest, the pinnacle of achievement in show business of that day, was Horace Goldin. Now, he was influenced and inspired by this man, Imro Fox, born Isidor Fuchs. Born in Bromberg, Germany in 1862, came to the U.S. in 1874. He was a top vaudeville act by 1879. He is sometimes referred to as the first comedy magician, a statement that is clearly not true. But his style was very influential, and he made an impact on others, particularly on Horace Goldin. Part of that, Fox worked at a very fast pace and without talking. And this appealed to Goldin because he had a strong stammer and also a very heavy accent. So we can understand why he decided to model himself on someone who worked with great speed and power and at the same time didn't open his mouth. He took Fox's speed and upped the ante. It was proclaimed that Goldin did more tricks in 15 minutes than most magicians do in an hour and a half. A very fine story about Horace Goldin is that he ultimately became an American citizen, and when he was being interviewed for part of the naturalization process, of course part of that is you have to study about American law and learn more about the way the American government works than most Native American people do. So the person interviewing Goldin said, as a naturalized citizen, could you become President of the United States? And Goldin replied, well, that's very nice, but I'm very busy with my career. Today, Goldin is best known as the person who basically introduced sawing a lady in half. The trick was actually invented by an English magician named P.T. Selbit in 1921. He called it the divided woman. But in his version, a woman got into a box, the box was sawn through, but it was Goldin who took it the extra step where the halves of the box were moved apart. And that made all the difference. And so that was only a year later in 1922, and it became an international sensation. And even today, it's one of the most typical tricks that someone will mention when the subject of magic is introduced. There were other vaudeville headliners who worked on a different style than Goldin. For example, this gentleman is Emil Jarrow, born Emil Jarosinski, born in Prussia in 1875. He began working as a strongman in a German circus, and then joined the Buffalo Bill Wild West show when it toured Europe in 1891, and he came with them when they returned to the United States. But in 1894, he broke his leg, and the strongman act was no longer an option, so he turned to magic, at which he excelled. He was a vaudeville headliner, but did not use big props like Horace Goldin. He used pocket-sized props. It's hard to imagine, but he would close his performance in theaters that sat 1,000 people or more with the transposition of a penny and a nickel. And he was a vaudeville star. His best known effect was borrowing a piece of paper money, causing it to vanish, and having it appear inside a lemon. A trick that some magicians still do. He was known for this, and there's a lovely story that he was working, headlining a theater in some major city, and across the street there was a rival vaudeville theater where the headliner was Horace Goldin. So on the marquee of the other theater it said, Horace Goldin sawing a woman in half. And Jarrow had them put on the marquee of his theater, Jarrow sawing a lemon in half. Jarrow was a talking act, and a very clever one. He worked in a style that's known as Dutch comic. In that case, it has nothing to do with Holland, but rather it's a corruption of the word Deutsch, meaning German. So he worked with a German accent, and it was a type of character that was popular in the day. He did reasonably well in vaudeville and reached a sort of limit as to how much they were willing to pay him. So he went to the agents who were booking these theaters and said, I've got a new act with a partner named Johnson. So you double our fee, and they did. We never had a partner. So he would get on stage and tell the audience that Johnson was sick that night. And whenever he did a line or a bit that didn't get a good reaction, he would say that was one of Johnson's. So this brings us back to where we started a moment ago, in London in 1910, and those 31 magicians, 4 of them being Jewish headliners. For those who are keeping score, one of them was Horace Goldin, one of them was Houdini, born Eric Weiss in Budapest in 1874. Karl Hertz, born Morgenstern in San Francisco in 1859, and Lafayette, born Sigmund Neuberger in Munich, Germany in 1872. Now, it's been a given that people have known for years that there's a disproportionate number of Jews in magic, specifically in Western magic, and in particular, we're talking about American magic for this evening because it's a little more containable. But no one has ever crunched the numbers. It's something everybody's sort of known, but nobody ever sat down to figure out what are the actual statistics. So I've done that. And these are not perfect statistics, but they're reasonably well informed. We can say that among notable 20th century American magicians, and by notable I don't mean necessarily known to the public, but at the very least recognized within the profession. The percentage of 20th century American magicians who are Jewish is 20%, which is the same as the percentage of American university professors who are Jewish, and the percentage of Ivy League students who are Jewish. Now, of course, in order to discuss this, we have to take a moment to identify what the hell do we mean by Jewish, right? Because it could be a religion, an ethnicity, a culture, a tradition. And I'm not going to try and answer that this evening. I think most of us here have a sense of what is Jewish as opposed to what isn't, or who is Jewish as opposed to who isn't. So we'll take sort of a general approach. Generally speaking, as we know, Judaism is matrilineal. So all of the people I'm talking about had at least a Jewish mother, most of them Jewish fathers as well. And that 20% number is significant compared to the Jewish population in the United States. It's very small in comparison to certain other fields. For example, the percentage of executives and producers in the motion picture industry during the 20th century hovers at about 80%. Somehow the Anti-Defamation League has managed to acknowledge this fact while still maintaining that we don't control the media. In the world of comic books, during the golden age of comic books, which is usually defined as from 1933 to 1956, the number of Jews creating comic books as writers, editors, and illustrators is about 90%. But that's not for someone else to give. And of course, in the area of the Broadway musical, from the 1930s through the late 60s, which is what Broadway calls its golden age, the number of composers and writers of Broadway musicals is statistically 100%. There are a couple of small exceptions, but if you play with math, it actually comes to essentially 100%. To put this in context, Jews make up 1/24th of 1% of the world's population. In the United States, there are currently less than 2.5% Jewish Americans. At the start of the 20th century, it was 1.8%. It has never risen above 3.7%. Now, there have been Jews in the United States since the 1600s, most of them being Sephardim, who came from Spain or Portugal. In 1818, the total number of Jews in the United States was 3,000. There was an influx of about 100 per year, and then came the first major wave of immigration, which was in the 1830s up through about 1870, and most of those were Ashkenazim from Germany. They were middle class and in most cases rather well educated. And by 1840, there were now 15,000 Jews in the United States. By 7 years later, that number had climbed to 50,000. Over the next 15 years, it tripled to 150,000. And then came 1881. At that time, Russia had half the world's Jewish population, also Ashkenazic. But after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, his successor, Alexander III, blamed the Jews, and of course that led to pogroms, etc. And at that time, therefore, 1/3 of Eastern European Jews, particularly those in Russia and on the Pale, left. And of those, 80% came to the United States. So between 1900 and 1914, 2 million more came. And everything continued until 1921, at which point Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act. And then in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, which established strong limits on immigration that mostly affected Asians, Southern Europeans, and Eastern European Jews. So that really is where this story takes off, because the population of Jews in the United States, toward the turn of the century, the 20th century, starts to stabilize and the culture starts to become formalized. And we can now explore, based on that demographic, what cultural ingredients led to the large number of Jews who went to show business in comparison to the other ethnic groups who were immigrating at the same time. At that same time, there were waves of immigrants coming from Ireland, specifically Irish Catholics, from Poland, I'm talking about Polish Catholics because the Polish Jews are bundled in with the other Eastern European Jews, and Southern Italians. So if we're going to establish why Jews became so involved with show business, and then specifically so involved with magic, we have to find answers that are not also shared by those other groups, right? I mean, if it's the same answer can be attributed to the Irish, then it isn't a specific reason why Jews got involved in a specific area. So when I asked around, when I was first starting the research on this talk, about a decade ago, I asked people, both magicians and non-magicians, why do you think there are so many Jews in magic? And the most common answer was, well, there's a tradition of mysticism in Judaism, right? The Kabbalah, all of that. To which my answer is, as opposed to the Italians? I think Italian culture of that time was every bit as mystical as Jewish culture, so that doesn't explain it. It can be a factor, an ingredient, but it isn't unique to the Jews. The second most common answer was, well, isn't there a tradition of storytelling among Jews? To which my response is yes, as opposed to the Irish. So the third answer that comes up is, well, isn't there a tradition of entertainment among Jews? I mean, we've all heard about the large Yiddish theater movement, and what about those guys in the Catskills, like Danny Kaye and Jerry Lewis, you know, the Tumblers? Well, there's only one problem with that answer. It's not true. The shtetl culture of Eastern Europe did not have entertainment per se. It was rabbinically forbidden to have theater shows. So the only entertainment that was found within shtetl culture was at weddings, when you could find klezmer musicians, and the marshalek, who was sort of the MC of such events, and the badchen, who was a kind of jester who would improvise songs and the like. And weddings could stretch out to a matter of days, and so these entertainers had a lot of material, but it was not considered a real profession. The only other show business element in shtetl culture had to do with celebrations of the holiday of Purim, which, starting in the early 1700s, were one of the only kind of entertainment events that took place in such communities. And over time, much as the Christian Passion plays evolved into formal European theater, those forum pageants slowly transformed into Yiddish theater. But despite the existence of a sparse number of traveling performance troupes, the first actual European Yiddish theater production, which took place in Iasi, Romania, was in 1876. That's pretty late in the game. From there, a few theaters opened in Russia, particularly in Odessa, until it was banned in 1883. And later, a scene grew in London and evolved into the United States. That's not a magic poster, that's a poster simply for a theater show at the Thalga Theater in New York on the Lower East Side. When the first Yiddish theaters opened in New York, around that time, the German Jews, who were of higher social status, tried to get the theaters closed. They thought it was unbecoming. They failed, happily enough for me. And by 1918, there were 20 theaters, Yiddish theaters in New York alone. As for the Tumler profession, the term only goes back to the 1930s. And here we're largely talking about what happened in the late 1800s. So none of those three explanations seems to suffice. I've come up with 5 explanations that I think add up to why there are so many Jewish magicians. And I'd like to tell you about them. Along the way, give you a few more anecdotes. Might even perform something for you. So we'll start with the first reason. And the first reason was simply that show business in general, and magic in specific, was available. That's not a small point, because in the late 19th century, many professions were closed to Jews. The first wave of German Jews had some success in the garment industry and in investment banking and retail sales, founding what were to become major department store chains and mail order companies. People like Benjamin Bloomingdale, the Gimbel brothers, Benjamin Altman, William Filene, David May, Levi Strauss. Some of these names I'm sure you recognize. But executive professions in steel, commercial banking, petroleum, and the automobile industry were simply not an option. So Jews were not allowed in those professions. And because most of the better universities had stringent quotas on Jewish applicants, and that stayed until the 1950s, various upscale professions that today are associated with Jews, such as medicine or the law, were largely kept out of reach. So not surprisingly, Jews turned to fields that were open to them. Of course, that meant a number of new industries where there were no closed doors yet and no quotas. These would include some newly revised fields such as cosmetics, Max Factor, Helena Rubinstein, liquor, boxing, basketball. Basketball didn't stay a Jewish thing for very long. Music publishing, and show business in general. Now, there was precedent for this, as shown in this poster. This is a dynasty of sorts, the Hermanns. It wasn't a full dynasty, it only lasted 1.5 generations. It was a German family, and the father, Samuel, who's not on the poster, he was a magician, but eventually quit to become a doctor. His son Karl was born in 1816 in Hanover, Germany. And Karl was the one on the bottom. And he learned from assisting his father, starting at the age of 10, and first toured the United States in 1867. In the 1830s, the family moved to Paris. They had 16 kids. The youngest was Alexander, who is shown there in the middle. He was born in 1843, and from the age of 9, he was assisting his older brother, Karl, and was touring with Karl, but in 1867 he left, and by the 1880s he had settled in the United States, become an American citizen, and became the most famous magician in the United States at the end of the 19th century.
Most famous what?
Magician. He was the most famous magician in the U.S. And the first really sort of national figure as a magician in the United States during the 1880s and 90s. You've seen lots of magicians with pointy beards and mustaches, goatees. Well, take a look at these 3 guys. The one at the top is the least important. That's Leon, who was a nephew. But if you notice the way their facial hair is groomed, they're the ones who put that style on the map as being associated with magicians. To this day, you see a lot of magicians similar goatee styles, and that all comes from the Hermans. They don't fit the immigration profile I was talking about. They were middle to upper class, quite educated. Both Karl and Alexander attended university. Alexander was fluent in 7 languages. Karl was reportedly fluent in more than that. But their importance to our story is not so much that they existed, but that their existence demonstrated that magic was a viable profession for Jews in the United States. That there were virtually no boundaries. There weren't closed doors. The first fraternal organization of magicians, the Society of American Magicians, which still exists, was founded in New York in 1902. Its initial membership only was about 30 people, and several of those were Jews, so it was there from the very start. This is the cover of the second issue of a magazine called The Sphinx, which was, for decades, the most important magazine for magicians. And this is the second issue, and there on the cover is our friend Horace Goldin. So obviously there were not restrictions to Jews being central in the story of American magic in 1902. Now that's not to say that there was no anti-Semitism in the magic world. It does crop up here and there. I won't mention most of the names involved because they wouldn't mean anything to you. But there were a few significant magicians who made their prejudices clear. I'll cite one example. There was a magician named Guy Jarrett, who was not a performer, he was an inventor. He invented many of the big illusions, some of which you still see done today. And he wrote a book that is highly regarded as a book regarding magic called Magic and Stagecraft. And it was his original ideas. The book is still in existence. It was, these days it's simply called the Jarrett book. It was first published in 1936, and in that book he charmingly refers to a cash register as a Jewish piano. So such things existed, but they weren't overwhelming. They were pretty minor in the world of magic. And it's also worth putting this into some perspective. Writing in 1881, Thomas Frost, discussing earlier magicians from the 1700s and earlier 1800s, wrote that the social position of the professional conjurer was even more dubious than that of the actor. So it was not considered a very high-class position until we get to the late part of the 19th century and we get into vaudeville. Initially, in the 19th century, American entertainment was divided into 2 large groups. There were theaters that catered to the upper class, and there were saloons that catered to the lower class. And the saloons were rowdy and the theater was very upscale. And then around 1880, a fellow named Tony Pastor created clean vaudeville, and that's what we think of today when we think about vaudeville. Variety acts, a multiple cast of 10 or 12 different acts, all performing on the same bill. And although Tony Pastor was of Italian ancestry, all of the vaudeville producers who followed in his wake were Jewish. Some of these names you may recognize: Claude Erlanger, Hammerstein, Ziegfeld, the Schuberts, all Jews. It was an open field because it was brand new. And by 1900, there were 2,000 theaters in the United States showing vaudeville shows, and 15,000 acts working the circuit regularly. And many of those, of course, were magicians. This one is a fellow named the Great Leon, or Leon Levy. He was born in New York in 1876, and by the 1920s, he was trooping with 2.5 tons of equipment. But, as I said earlier regarding Goldin and Jarrett, some of the magicians who did very, very well in vaudeville had much smaller props. This is a photograph of Nate Leipzig, who was born Nathan Leipziger in Stockholm, Sweden in 1873. He was brought to the United States as a child, lived in Detroit working as an optician, or an assistant to an optician, until 1902 when he moved to New York and entered vaudeville. And his act was done using very small props, playing cards and coins. But because he would have a couple of people up from the audience, they could verify, even for a large audience, what was going on. The one thing he did that was physically made large, you ever seen someone roll a coin down their fingers? That was invented by Nate Leipzig. And he called it the steeplechase. And he would do it on stage, but because the audience couldn't see it, they would lower a screen and they would project a silent film of his hand doing it as part of his show. when movies were a pretty rare thing just to begin with. To give you an idea where this all went, in September of 1928, the Daily Forward, the leading Yiddish newspaper, had an article with the headline, "Leading American Magicians Are Jews." And the opening sentence is, "When a Jew rolls up his sleeves, it doesn't always mean business. It may mean magic." And the article talks about Leon and Houdini and Hardin, who was Houdini's younger brother, and Jarrow and Goldin and Leipzig. So people we've been talking about were starting to make some waves. And that brings us to our second reason why there's a disproportionate number of Jews in this profession. And I think this, to me, this in some ways is the most important of the five. Why magic instead of other types of show business? I mean, there were obviously Jewish dancers, Jewish singers, and all sorts of entertainers. But why magic specifically? And I think that's because, unlike almost any other ethnic group, in Judaism, culturally, there has been a cultural celebration of intellectual pursuit. Part of the reason for that is because since the medieval era, Jews were not permitted to own land in Europe. And so there were very few Jewish farmers. So whereas, during this late 19th century period, immigrants from Gentile Poland or southern Italy, 75% of them were farmers and manual laborers. Whereas the Jews who immigrated at that time, 75% of them were skilled laborers, including many professions that didn't involve picking up any tools, but rather writing and such. Scholarship was prized in the Shtetl community. Most of the education was, of course, in Keter, religious education, but unlike Christian teaching, which emphasizes dogma and faith, Jewish teaching, as I'm sure almost everyone here knows, has a long history of encouraging questions, discussion, and even argument. And as a consequence, one of the most highly respected qualities in Jewish culture was, and still is, wit. And thus, the Jews who entered show business skewed toward the more intellectual types of performance. Behind the scenes, they were involved in producing and booking and writing and composing. And in terms of performance itself, the major lines were either comedy or magic, both of those very intellectual disciplines, if you think about it. By the second decade of the 20th century, there were 7 daily newspapers published in Yiddish in New York alone. It's worth noting that, as I mentioned earlier, there were very few silent Jewish magicians, albeit there were some very successful exceptions. I mentioned the Emerald Fox and Horace Goldin. More recently, this gentleman, who was holding a large light bulb. He was known, he's still alive, but when he was still performing, he was known sometimes simply under the name Mr. Electric, whose act preceded the kind of electronics we have today, and he would produce the lit light bulb. It was quite miraculous. His performing name was Marvin Roy. He was born Marvin Lee in Southern California in 1925, and he toured the world. In 1957, he became one of the very first magicians to play Las Vegas, although the casino made him pretend he was French. That was not an anti-Semitic thing, that was because they wanted the show to seem very cosmopolitan. And since he didn't talk, it didn't give the game away. But for the most part, when it comes to magic and so many other things, our people won't shut up. And therefore, most Jews in magic have done talking acts. It's also a reason why in the subcategory of mentalism, which is theatrical mind reading or memory demonstrations, hypnosis, lightning calculation, the number of Jews in that subcategory is actually about 35%, which is roughly the same percentage as American Nobel Prize winners who are Jews. The most famous mind reader of the first half of the 20th century was this gentleman, Joseph Dunninger, born in New York in 1892, and started performing professionally in 1909, and by 1920 he was doing mentalism. He worked dime museums, Vaudeville, had a radio show in 1929, and then another show on the radio in 1943 and 44, which became the second highest rated show on the NBC Blue network, back in the days when Radio was it, there wasn't TV. Dunninger's mother was Jewish, his father was a German Catholic. There seems to be no clear record of Dunninger's self-designation. That said, his best friend for decades was Al Flosso, a Jewish magician about whom we'll talk shortly. And then there's this photograph. This is a fairly amazing photograph from the collection of Bob Rossi, which shows a theater, specifically Gold's Theater in New York, around 1915, advertising an early Dunninger performance. He's partnered with someone named Devlin, about whom we don't know. But if you look carefully, you'll see that to the right side of that banner, that's Yiddish. And it indicates something about the audience for that particular theater. And it also presents the intriguing possibility that Dunninger was able to perform in Yiddish. We don't know that, but it's kind of nice to think maybe he did. And so with that in mind, I would like to take a moment to perform something for you. I will do this in English. And I'm going to ask someone to join me here on the great stage. How are we doing on lights? Is that, can you see me from this position? Is that a yes?
You're in the yes.
All right. Do we have the opportunity to kick up the house lights at all, Karen? If we could kick them up just a little bit, that would be great. If not, it's all right. I'm going to ask someone to join me here on the great stage, and I think we'll ask the gentleman who appears from this distance to be a gray sweater. The gentleman with the glasses right there, yes? Didn't mean to wake up. That join me here? All right. What is your name? Gary. Gary, I'm going to ask you to help me out. Perfect lines, thank you. Actually, to help me out, we're going to do something in 3 phases. All right? Let me turn that off. Not distracted. 3 phases, and you are going to participate, but your level of participation is going to be more in each phase. So for the first phase, you're basically here just as a witness. You're just going to watch from a close distance to make sure that what I say I'm doing really is what I'm doing. Fair? All right. You presume. All right. I'm going to get someone else to help me, but this person does not have to leave her seat. Ooh, all the women just flinched. The lady who's sitting right there, what is your name? Michal. You can stay where you are and make this very easy. This is a deck of playing cards, and Gary, because you're up here close, you can verify they're all different. All right? Do you know the names of the cards? Okay, good. Tell us your favorite one. Anyone you like. The Queen of Hearts, that's a very good card. That's a very regal card, very upper class. I like that. I'm going to leave the cards in the order they happen to be in. We just gave a quick mix. I'm going to fan them so that the back of each and every card is facing toward Michal. Do we start from your left or your right? From the right. I'll start moving my finger along from the right, and whatever you like, you call stop. Okay, before I get past that, we're doing pantomime. We'll start again, from the left to the right. This time from the left, okay? Okay, I'm kind of in between 2 cards, but my finger really is, I think it's more on this one, is that fair? But that really is where she said stop. I didn't suddenly move 10 cards over. Let me squeeze that out, Gary, so we know it's still the same card. Still? Yeah, no question. It's important we establish that. Because Michal, you could have stopped me anywhere. You could have stopped me over here, down here, back here. Instead, you chose to stop me here, just a little left of center. Much like many members of this audience. But how long ago you named your card? What card did you name? The Queen of Hearts. Oh, with Dad. Your witness, the only Queen of Hearts in the deck, and it's where she stopped me. Are we being fair? Oh, good, because in this next phase, your involvement gets a little more complicated. In this phase, you get to play the part of the table. Well, assume the table position. You apparently have a very different show in mind. I just meant hold out your hand. Very dirty-minded group over here. I don't want to handle it. here's the table. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to get someone a little further back where they thought it was safe. How about the gentleman who is in what appears to be a blue shirt with a necktie? Looking down, wondering what he's wearing? Yes, you can say where you are. You can say where you are. What is your name, sir?
Michael.
Michael. Michael, you're going to name a card. You can name any card you want except for the Queen of Hearts because Michal already chose that. But you can name any other card.
Jack of Spades.
The Jack of Spades. Now that's another royal card. We've got a very classy audience tonight. All right. They are all different. I want to make sure that they know that. Here's what we're going to do, Michael. I'm going to take the cards. We'll hold them face down. I will cut them into small groups onto the table. And whatever you like, you're just going to call stop.
Stop.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Now that really is where he said stop, right? Right here. What was your card?
Jack of Spades.
Jack of Spades.
Oh my gosh.
Well, Gary, this is your moment. This is the third phase. This is where you really get involved. Because in this case, you get to name a card. Now, the only restrictions are you can't name the Queen of Hearts because that was chosen by Michal, and you can't name the Jack of Spades because that's Michael's choice. But that gives you 50 other opportunities. So what card do you like? We've stopped it.
That's quite close. How about the Five of...
The Five of Hearts. There's a popular favorite. Five of Hearts. I have no funny lines to say about that. But we'll do it this way. Let me get them kind of mixed up. Put your hands down at your side. You are right-handed, correct? So I've just done something impressive even though they didn't respond. No. All at once or nothing. Take your left forefinger. And just, as I spread through, just touch your arm. Just wipe down. Okay, take it. Take 2 or 3 or 4. No, take a bunch. Take several. Don't look at them. Just take several and just hold them face down and mix them. Mix them as thoroughly as you can mix. How many you got? 3 or 4? 3. Okay. Mix them as thoroughly as you can mix 3 things. And then, if you would, I'll put my hand out. You put one of those cards face down onto the palm of my hand. Any one you like. And you went to the one on top. That was a random thing. Did you want to trade it, or are you happy with it? All right. A different one on the palm of my right hand. All right. Now you're happy with this, or do you want to trade that? You're happy holding on to that. You sure? Okay. It's important. What was the name of your card? A5 of Hearts. Show them the card. Yeah. You had no choice but to keep your 5 of Hearts. You had no choice because you couldn't pick this card. That was Michael's Jack of Spades. You couldn't pick this card. That was Michal's Queen of Hearts. You can come and see my show anytime. So, let's get back to talking a little bit about magic history. Mike back to here, and I think we bring it back. There we are, we're back to that theater. Let's get to the third characteristic of Jewish culture that I think has led to a lot of Jewish magicians. And that, boiled down to a single word, is otherness. Unlike the other immigrant groups that we're talking about, and some came before and after, prior to coming to America, Jews were already a minority group. If you think about it, that's a pretty strong difference between Jews and most of the other groups coming at that time. According to the writer C. Bezalel Sherman, in 1960, he wrote, Jews were able to skip the whole process of accustoming themselves to minority status, which demanded so much energy from other groups. A British economic journal stated in 1888, quote, the Jews have shown a marked excellence in what can be called the commerce of imperceptibles. The historian and philosopher Isaiah Berlin described Jews as outsiders who, knowing that they may be asked to leave, quote, become primary authorities on the natives. And this helps to explain why Jews dominated the creative side of the motion picture industry, and it also suggests why America's Jewish magicians were often able to gain entry into mainstream society, even at a time when ordinary Jews were kept out. Which brings us to this gentleman. This is Louis Krieger, sometimes referred to as Pop Krieger, born Ludwig Krieger in 1851 in Germany. His background was in the circus, but he moved to New York in 1885, and by 5 years later, he had become a society performer at private parties. He also did vaudeville theaters and other types of venues, but his primary focus was entertaining at the private homes of the very wealthy. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, the Astors and the Vanderbilts. We're talking the highest level. During the summer months, when high society escaped the grueling heat of the city and went to resorts in the White Mountains of New Hampshire or Lake Placid in the Adirondacks, Krieger would follow them there, performing in one hotel and another until Labor Day, when everyone came back to New York. Often billed as Professor Krieger, and sometimes given the tag, the Merry Wizard, his show included aerial fishing, a very old effect that probably began in China, which involves taking a fishing rod with an empty hook at the end of the line and casting it out into the air and catching a fish, a real one. A friend of mine in Las Vegas named Matt King, who is not Jewish but who does what I think is the best show in Las Vegas, does this in his show every afternoon at Haworth Casino. So the next time you go to Vegas, so you want something new in the afternoon, go see Mac. But Krieger did other stuff with livestock. For a show that he did for the National Conjurers Association in the 1920s, he produced, from a top hat, he produced a bunch of silk handkerchiefs and other items, and his intention was to finish by producing a long-haired guinea pig. But to his surprise, he wound up producing 5 guinea pigs because the first guinea pig had given birth to 4 more while inside the hat. Krieger's most popular routine was the cups and balls. This is considered by many to be the oldest trick in magic. You've probably seen versions of it, where there are usually 3 cups and a ball or more that jumps around, changes places, and usually at the end, the balls turn into something else. And Krieger often ended with the last things being under the cups being fruit, which was then as now a popular way to end it, big fruit inside the cups. But sometimes he would produce live mice, and on many occasions he closed that routine by producing boiled potatoes that were too hot to hold. Nobody's doing that these days. Now, other items in his repertoire included producing a 10-pound cement paving block from under a borrowed hat, and biting off the button from a spectator's jacket and then restoring it. Now, these are pretty good tricks, but if I were to say this in front of a group of magicians, they would all immediately say, well, wait a minute, those tricks were done by Max Malini. And they'd be right. But Krieger's the one who Malini got it from. That's a picture of Max Malini. You guys know, we just went blank. Hang on. That's a picture of Max Malini at a very young age. He was born Max Katz Bright in Ostrów, Poland in 1873, came to New York while still quite young. In his mid-teens, Malini tended bar when he was like 13, 14 years old, at a bar in the Bowery in New York, where he worked not only behind the bar, but also serving and was sometimes a singing waiter. The owner of the bar was a retired performer known as Professor Seiden. Very little is known about Seiden. He was born in the mid-1800s, probably in what is today known as Latvia. He was a professional magician, ventriloquist, and fire eater, working across Europe. Now, it turns out that Frank Seiden, which was his first name, that took me a year to find out, is an important person in a different branch of show business. Because from 1901 to 1905, he recorded over 200 Yiddish songs for Edison Cylinders, and then early records from Columbia and Victor. There are no known pictures of Frank Seiden, so the best I can offer you is the label from one of his records. But he recorded a wide range of Yiddish songs, so he was quite well known and still is in that world. The people who collect old Yiddish music and or early recordings in general, they know who he is. Magicians only know that there was this guy named Professor Seiden who taught Max Malini. The bar that he owned was located in the Bowery, as I say. Seiden apparently won it in a poker game. That tells you a lot about it right there. And it was at that bar that he taught magic to Max Malini, who he used to refer to as Quetzala. Kitty. Seiden died in 1931, by which time he was probably in his 80s. Malini went on to bigger and better things. That's Malini at a slightly older age. After learning from Seiden, he started busking, in other words, performing on the streets, passing the hat. He wound up spending time at Coney Island, where he got to know Jarrow, the fellow we talked about earlier, and they sometimes worked as a team. And eventually, modeling himself to some great degree on Krieger, he became a society magician. Contemporary magazine article stated that by the 1920s, Malini had become, quote, the highest salaried private entertainer in the world. At least as early as 1922, he did a full evening show in theaters. The second half of the show was done in Chinese style. So he would wear Chinese robes and do tricks associated with China, such as the production of bowls of water and the linking rings. During that half of the show, he would talk ostensibly in Chinese. Most of his audience didn't know it, but he was speaking Yiddish. Relatively little has been written about the relationship between Malini and Krieger. Malini has had much better press. He lived longer and worked in a much larger world. Some have recently suggested that maybe Krieger copied some of Malini's repertoire. However, considering that Krieger was 22 years older than Malini, I think they probably shared ideas and it was a two-way street. And much of the traffic probably went from Krieger to Malini. But regardless, Malini was clearly a great magician in his own right, and he far outdid Krieger in building an audience of the rich and royal around the world. There's a classic anecdote about Malini. It's not clear, first of all, it's not clear that the anecdote is true, but it hopefully is. And it's not clear if it happened in New York or London or Paris. But the story is he was doing a private show in the home of some really wealthy people. And he had asked to borrow a table, which they provided. And he did a routine that was one of his specialties called the card stab, where cards were selected from a deck, which was then smushed all over the tabletop, and he was blindfolded, and he would take a knife, and impossibly he would stab the chosen cards. And when he did the routine at this particular event, the woman whose home it was said, "Oh my God, that is a Louis XVI table." And Malini immediately replied, "Madam, it is now worth more. They say that those marks were made by Max Malini." Whether that story is true or not, we know other stories about Malini which suggest that he had the kind of bravado that would have led him to say something like that. His great ability was to create what seemed to be impromptu miracles, even though sometimes he had prepared long in advance. And one of the best accounts of that took place at some point in the early 20th century in Jamaica. He did some shows in Jamaica at one of the upper scale hotels, and he was invited to dinner at the home of the governor. In those days, that would have been an English person. And when Malini arrived for dinner, there was a group of maybe 12 or more people sitting at a very elegant and big table in a very elaborate dining room, and the meal was served by waitstaff. And when it came time for the entree, for the main course, it turned out they were serving roasted pig. And to show that this was not accidental, but was being done sort of as a prank, the pig's head was what was served to Malini. It was put on the place in front of him. And Malini took his cloth napkin and threw it over the pig's head in apparent horror. And then he said, "Lord God, please don't make this poor Jew eat pork." And then he whipped away the napkin, and there were 2 turkey legs, 2 turkey drumsticks.
Wow.
So, needless to say, this caused quite the reaction. But there's a better part to the story, which is that 2 days later, Malini was still in Jamaica, and he received a message from the governor. And so I'm assuming a servant went by. There probably weren't phones on the island at the time, but the message was, Mr. Malini, you won the game. Absolutely. You somehow suspected what we were going to play on you, and you turned it into a great magical moment. The problem is we don't know where you stashed the pig's head. We can't find it, and the mansion smells terrible. So please tell us where you hid it. So presumably he did. That's as far as I know the story to go. To recap, to bring us back to where we were, we're over the hump. We're past most of the stuff, but the starting reason was that it was available. The profession of magic was one that was open to Jewish citizens of the United States in the late 19th century. The second is the cultural celebration of intellectual pursuit as being a feature of Yiddishkeit, dating back before the United States, but continuing during the time the Jews were in the United States. The third reason is otherness, being outsiders. And the fourth reason is the opposite side of the coin, and the third reason. The fourth reason is assimilation. Unlike other contemporary immigrant groups of that era, Jews were very adept at assimilation. In 1909, by 1909, only 23% of New York school-age Jewish children were getting any form of religious education. The rest were entirely secular. From 1914 to 1924, consumption of kosher meat in the US fell by 30%. In the 1940s, that was the peak period of legal name changing in the United States. 50,000 people filed to change their names every year, and of those, 80% were Jews. Then you have the dawn of rhinoplasty. Rhinoplasty, or nose jobs, actually goes back about 2,500 years, but the modern version, which is when it became a more minor cosmetic correction rather than a serious fix for injury or the like, that only begins around 1921, and that's when you have performers like Fanny Brice and Milton Berle getting nose jobs that in turn get a lot of publicity. In Vaudeville, there were Hebrew comics, I'm using that word in quotes, but that's what they're referred to, as there were comics stereotyping almost every ethnic group. There were Hebrew comics at least as early as 1875, but the early Hebrew comics were all Gentiles. The first one recorded is a fellow named Frank Bush. Jewish magicians, for the most part, ignored their Jewish identities while on stage, and some even presented themselves as being from other ethnic groups. Here's an example. The gentleman who is on top of the elephant, along with a couple of other cast members, we met earlier. That's the great Leon. Except this was during a period that he was billing himself under the name Chunda Hulu, and pretending to be an East Indian. Another, even more noteworthy magician is this. That is a poster depicting a performer who, as you can see, is named Okito. Well, Okito was born Theodore Bamberg in Amsterdam, Holland, in 1875, and he was part of a real magic dynasty, not the generation and a half of Hermans, but this was actually 6 generations worth of magicians. When he began performing, because he was deaf, his speech was lousy. And so he started doing a silent act. Again, one of the rarities, but he, again, had a good reason. He started off doing a Japanese act. And so he had authentic costuming and props. And he took the stage name Okito, which is an anagram of the European spelling of Tokyo. However, after the first year or two, he discovered that Japanese costuming was not easy to work in. He had too many tight parts. So he switched over to doing a Chinese style act, which is what you see being advertised here. But he already had made a name for himself, so he continued working under the name Okito for the rest of his life. Now, he moved to the United States in 1908, became a citizen in 1916, and so what you had there was a Dutch Jew with a faux Japanese name doing a Chinese act who became an American citizen. But just to complicate the story further, his son, David Bamberg, who was raised in the US, also started doing a Chinese act under the name Fu Manchu. He became a huge star in South America, and with a full evening show, and he did talk when performing, but in Spanish. So it just complicates the story a little more. This next gentleman was a performer based in New York, born in 1894, who worked under the name Muhammad Bey. Clearly an Egyptian, except that his real name was Samuel Leo Horowitz. And then we come back to this gentleman. We met him before. This is Emil Jarrow, who worked, as I said earlier, in the Dutch comic style, which is to say a German dialect. Now, to be sure, many Jewish musicians did not make a great effort to hide their Jewishness. Anyone paying attention would have realized that, for example, Horace Goldin, despite the mildly more mainstream change of surname, and despite his onstage silence, which prevented the audience from hearing his accent, it was very clear that he was Jewish from his appearance and his manner. But he didn't try to make that a selling point. It was just along for the ride. Bear in mind that in New York, which at the period we're talking about was really the hub of American show business, in the 1920s and 30s, the population of New York was 25% Jewish. And it has been determined that the theater-going audience was 50% Jewish. So in New York theaters, being Jewish was not an issue and was not a problem. But for the rest of the country, particularly away from the larger cities, it could be a problem. For example, Eddie Cantor, who we all remember as being a popular vaudeville star, when he was a star on Broadway, he would deliver lines with Yiddish intonations. He would actually use Yiddish vocabulary in making comments when he would ad-lib something on the side. So the Jewish aspect of his stage persona was very upfront. And then he went to Hollywood. And after he made his first major studio picture, called Whoopi in 1930, he began a process of what the writer Irving Howe calls desemitization, willfully de-emphasizing his Jewish speech cadences, vocabulary, social references, and so on. And this became increasingly true with comedians in the 1920s and into the 30s, so that you had Jewish comedians such as Ed Wynn, Bert Lahr, Jack Benny, George Burns, and all of them downplayed their ethnicity, and although today we know that they were Jews, the public at that time, for the most part, didn't know. They didn't think they were anything specific, but they didn't think that they were Jews. This ties into an interesting story regarding the one area of American magic other than Christian gospel magic, where Jews are almost non-existent, and that is Chautauqua. I don't know if anybody remembers that term. Chautauqua was based on the earlier Lyceum movement. It was named after a town in upstate New York where it began in 1874. It was founded by Methodists as a sort of extended Sunday school for rural families. And so they would have events that would take place usually inside a tent, a large tent. And these were originally sort of sermons. But gradually over time they became more entertaining and moved into something closer to what today we would refer to as motivational speaking, and then full-out entertainment, with performers doing usually fairly long shows, an hour and a half. By the 1920s, at the peak of the Chautauqua circuit, there were thousands of locations for Chautauqua, most of them being held in these large tents. Many, many magicians performed on this circuit, and for some it was their primary work. But in all of the records that I've been able to see, there are literally only 2 Jewish magicians who seem to have been able to get into that circuit. Because even though it was no longer explicitly Methodist, that was essentially the characteristic of the audience. Pop Krieger was one who as we saw earlier, seemed to be able to get it to perform anywhere. And this man, whose name is Josephi, born Joseph Freud, in Vienna, Austria in 1873, moved to Chicago in 1892, a master mechanic who created some extraordinary and complex solutions, most famously Balsamo, the talking skull. In 1997, 51 years after the death of Josephi, I was privileged to become the only other performer to ever present Balsamo. The skull was crafted back to life by John Gaughan, who is a master builder who lives in the LA area. I performed it once. It took 2 months to prepare. It doesn't have much to do with the talk I'm giving today, but I just thought I might post it. And this brings us to our fifth and final reason as to why I think there have been so many Jews in American magic during the 20th century, and that is networking. They all knew each other. This is a photograph, and there are 4 people in the car and then one sitting on the running board. And you might recognize that the fellow on the left, sitting in the car with the straw skimmer, very good, that's Max Malini, and the one sitting on the very right, Horace Goldin. And the guy who's sitting on the running board is a man named Sam Margulies, who did not usually perform professionally. When he did, he used the name Rami Samini, another fake Middle Eastern name. Early on in life, he was an assistant to Goldin, but he later became a lawyer, and so he was the lawyer for Goldin and other magicians, and also produced magic shows. So this is just one kind of casual photograph that shows 3 important magicians, 2 of them exceedingly important, just hanging out, being friendly. When I say they all knew each other, I can sort of prove that. Let's start with, there we are, that's Louis Krieger. He lived just off the intersection of 3rd Avenue and 116th Street in Harlem, which in those days, in the late 19th century, was a largely Jewish neighborhood. And a few blocks away lived Horace Goldin, and also Harry Houdini. At the end of the 19th century, both Goldin and Houdini worked together at Coney Island, often sharing the bill with Jarrow, who later moved down the street from Krieger. Another one from that Coney Island group was Houdini's younger brother, Hardeen. And as mentioned, they all knew Sam Margulies. I've gotten ahead of myself. Yes, Margulies is the one in the tux, the one that just popped up. There is Jarrow. So did I get that right? I'm looking down here, so for me to follow what I'm clicking on. A few years later, having moved up the show business ladder, both Goldin and Houdini were working in London and reached out to help a young magician named Karl Rossini, or Johann Rosen, in Lodz, Poland in 1885. And he was thankful enough that when Goldin died in 1939, Rossini paid for his tombstone. Sometime after London, Rossini did a South American tour in partnership with Akiba. And of course, Max Malini lived across the street from Krieger. Another neighbor was Louis Schoenberg, originally named Levi Schoenberg, who was a magician and strongman, and not that famous as a magician, but worth including because his daughter, Minna, was the mother of these guys. The Marx Brothers. Krieger had 10 kids. His son, Willie, became a professional magician and did vaudeville and sideshows, and then he later taught this man, that's Abraham Hurwitz, a Yeshiva University professor, who, in 1930, was named the official magician of New York by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, and who taught magic in conjunction with the New York City Parks Department. First using the name the Peter Pan Magic Club, which was then changed to Future American Magic Entertainers. FAME, exactly an acronym. And through the roster of members of FAME over the next several decades, there came a number of magicians who went on to become quite famous, and you won't know most of these names. If there's anybody here who's ever dipped his toe or her toe into magic, you might recognize a few of them. Albert Goshman, George Sands, Ken Krenzel, Howie Schwartzman, George Schindler, Ken Silverman, Simon Aronson, and Percy Diaconis, and that is a really small sampling of noteworthy people who passed through fame. It's also worth mentioning that Abe Hurwitz's daughter, Phyllis Hurwitz, followed in his footsteps as a magician and ventriloquist. She changed her name to Sherry Lewis. Now, in 1925, one of Krieger's daughters, Lillian, married a young magician who had traveled as a valet for both Krieger and Malini. He was born Albert Levinson in 1895, but he took the name Al Flosso. I'm sorry, that was the wife. There's Al Flosso. Flosso was a remarkable guy. He had a great story as to how he got his name. Flosso started professional work in Coney Island, and he always told the story that there was a 10-in-1. Now, what that means, it's a sideshow where 10 acts under one canvas roof in a tent. And 10-in-1s were popular because they one admission, you got to see 10 different things. And Flosso as a kid wanted to get a booking. And the owner of the 10-in-1 said, "I'll book you, but only if you change your name to Flosso." And he said, "Okay, why?" And he said, "Because I have a banner, a hand-painted banner that advertises Flosso the Wonder Dog. And if you'll change your billing to Flosso the Wonder Boy, I only have to have two letters repainted." It's a great story. It's clearly not true because Flosso's mother's maiden name was Flosserstein. So we can assume that that's where the name actually came from. By 1915, he was working the Dreamland Sideshow in Coney Island, later toured with circuses, and eventually in 1939, he purchased the oldest magic shop in the United States, which had passed through a variety of hands. As a wedding gift, when Harry Houdini attended the wedding of Flosso and Krieger's daughter, Houdini gave them as a wedding gift a notebook with the details of a two-person mind-reading act that he had done with his wife, Beatrice, many years before. So there's another connection. Al and Lily Flosso had a son, Jackie, who also became a professional magician and eventually took over the shop in New York. And now, almost 60 years ago, Flosso performed at the bar mitzvah of this guy. That is a photograph of a young New York magician named Richard Potash. Today he looks like this. That's Ricky Jay, who some of you know of, has had hugely successful work off Broadway and been in films and so forth. So you can see when I say they all knew each other, I'm not kidding around. There is a large community of magicians to this day who know each other, and it's not exclusively based on one ethnicity or another, but the Jews, then as now, knew each other. This brings us to a subcategory that during the 20th century ran to about 42% Jewish, which is the same percentage as Tony Award-winning writers for Best Non-Musical Play. And that is the category of magic dealer. There are a couple of major examples. The one on the right is Louis Tannen, and the one on the left is Jack Channon. And I have to say that the high percentage of Jewish magic dealers feeds right into several negative stereotypes. Can't change the truth in this case. It does sometimes almost seem cartoonish. And when I click on that cartoon, if magicians were in the audience, they'd be laughing, because this is a cartoon of a not very good person named born Harry Levy, but known to the magic world as Hank Lee, a magic dealer in the Boston area who a few years ago went to prison for major skimming of customers' credit cards. And to my eternal embarrassment, I drew that picture 40 years ago. That was his logo when he was still in business. Anyway, to wrap things up, after World War II, a new school of magic with roots in the 1930s came into its own, and that would be modern close-up magic. And the seminal text for this, which is still sold today, is called Stars of Magic, which was published serially between 1946 and 1954, later compiled into a book that is now a classic and is still being sold in magic shops. It is, in many ways, the mid-century summation of American magic. And of the 11 magicians whose work is detailed and explained in that book, 5 of them are Jews. The trend was continued into the 1960s and 70s by a wave of influential magicians who specialized in close-up and card magic, including several of the famed members I mentioned, plus a whole bunch of others with last names like Schwartz, Weiner, and Kaufman, and Roth. And if this makes it sound like all of the significant players in magic were Jews, it's not true, but sometimes it feels like it. This is a photograph taken at a New York magic gathering in the 1970s. It appeared in a magic magazine. And when I was paging through that particular issue, I saw this picture. This was not a specialized group and not a themed event. It was simply a gathering at a restaurant of the members of a local New Jersey magic club. Every single person in the photograph is a Jew. Not the rabbit, but everybody else. Now, some of this stems from the fact that post-war America, perhaps as a form of collective post-facto guilt, went through a phase where the level of anti-Semitism was at an all-time low. Not a phase we're currently in, but after the war. So this, in turn, enabled many Jewish entertainers to embrace their ethnicity in a public way. This is particularly true in comedy, where you had people like Buddy Hackett, Shelley Berman, Mike Nichols, and Lang May, who were doing ecumenical routines, but their cultural references and patterns of speech were clearly Jewish. Lenny Bruce, born Leonard Schneider, grew up in a home where only English was spoken, but as his career evolved, he began to actively insert Yiddish phrases into his work. Sid Caesar became a major TV star, and not only was he Jewish, but most of his writers were, including Mel Brooks, Neil Simon, and Woody Allen. So one result of this mass exposure was that during the 1950s and early 60s, almost 100 Yiddish words entered mainstream English vocabulary in this country. And for me, the quintessential Jewish magician comes to the fore during this period. And there he is as a young man. This is Meyer Kessler, who was born in Chicago in 1917, but you wouldn't have known him under that name. You might have seen him more like this. Carl Ballantine, who did his first Ed Sullivan appearance in 1953 and his first Las Vegas run in 1956, and later went on to great success as a comedic actor on the television series McHale's Navy, where he played Gruber, and on Broadway, where he starred in the second version of The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Now, Carl never proclaimed his Jewishness, but he didn't have to. His timing, his intonation, his rhythms couldn't have been anything other than an American Jew. He hit his stride when he abandoned doing serious magic. His comedy act was predicated on the fact that none of his tricks worked. But it was always built on the conceptual foundation of theatrical magic, and magicians happily claimed him as their own. If we filter our list of notables, which remember was 20% of magicians, to just magicians known to the public, so ones like Carl, who got some mainstream identification, depending on how you parse that information, the percentage jumps up to between 30 and 40%, which is the approximate number or percentage of Jewish Oscar winners for Best Original Screenplay. There's much more to cover, but I'll end this talk with the following piece of information. If you go onto Google or any of the other search engines and type in the names of contemporary American magicians in 2018, there are very few who will generate over 1 million hits. Depending on the program and the quirks of data entry, the results come in at different amounts, usually only 4 or 5, always less than 10. And in every case, the percentage of the names that come up with hits of over 1 million is always over 50%. Largely because of these two fellows. That's David Copperfield, born David Copkin, on the left, and David Blaine, born David Blaine, on the right. And these are arguably the two most famous magicians in the United States and have been for the last decade or more. So what does this mean? It means that the topic is interesting enough to warrant a lot of research and a lecture presentation, which we have now come to the end. I know you're really tired, and I thought it would be only fair if I did one more magic use. To send you home, hopefully with a smile. So I'm going to move this back to my previous position. Let me get rid of the competition. Okay. And we're going to try something, and we'll get someone up from the audience to help me out. And I think we're going to get someone who... okay, this is sort of a public service announcement. If you close your eyes, I can still see you. Gentlemen, there you got a nice big red. What is your name, sir? Aaron, come and join me here at the front. You get a nice round of applause. Aaron. Nice to see you, sir. We're going to have a little psychological game here, and it's not too unusual for those who watch television, which these days pretty much everybody. You ever watched any TV game shows? Which you have. So you know the basic concept. The basic idea with a television game show is that a member of the audience is given the opportunity to play a game, usually not too difficult. And depending on what choices they make and how they do, they can sometimes go home with fabulous prizes. You could go home with a fabulous prize tonight. Try to keep your enthusiasm down to a manageable level. Now, in this particular game, we're going to make use of some very simple materials. I brought 3 envelopes. And as you can see, each envelope is a different color. And in various cultures, color can have meaning, right? The color blue tends to be associated with dreaming, imagination, intellectual pursuits, creativity. The color red in most cultures has something to do with passion, romance, strong emotions. The color black is the color of my own. So each one has a particular reason for identifying a quality that might appeal to you. In a moment, you're going to select one of these envelopes, Art. Now, I'll tell you right now, each of these envelopes contains a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper, it tells you what prize you won if you pick that envelope. You don't pick the envelope, you don't get that prize. Understand the basic rules? Okay, now before you make a choice, ordinarily on game shows they say, please, no coaching from the audience. But I want you to have all the help you can get. So I encourage coaching in the following way. I want each of you to imagine that you're standing here where Oren is and that you're about to make that choice. Those of you who think that Oren should choose the blue envelope, let him know with your applause. So far, blue is in the lead. How many people think that Oren should choose the red envelope? I heard that red got a little more. How about for the black envelope? It's a really close person. Hard to say, red might just have nudged out black, but then again, there are members of this audience who might want to flatter the performer and change their minds. It really isn't their choice. It's your choice. So you can go with what they've suggested. They're kind of steering you away from blue. But you don't have to listen to them. You can have any one of the envelopes you want. What would you want? You want the blue one. Now, maybe I'm doing some reverse psychology out here, right? Because the fewest number of people applauded for blue, but I pointed that out. So maybe I was trying to do sort of like a cushion shot in billiards and tried to steer you over to the blue. If you think that I have steered you over to the blue, you may change your mind and trade for the red. Or you may change your mind, flatter your performer, and switch to the black. Sticking with blue. A man with convictions, I like that. Take the blue envelope yourself, Warren. Now, what I would like you to do is to peek inside the envelope. It's not sealed. There's a piece of white paper. Do you see the paper? Take the paper out. But it's folded up. Do not open the paper. That's the big finish. Because that paper tells you what prize you've won. But before we find out what prize you've won, we want to find out what prizes you didn't win. Right? Now, a lot of people in this audience encourage you to pick the red envelope, right? The red envelope contains a piece of paper, and what it says, in big letters, it says, you will not choose the red envelope. This coupon is worth $100. You're not laughing now. If you had picked the red envelope, as so many of these people urged you to do, I would have given you $100 in cash right this moment. But you didn't pick it, it says so right here. Now you also didn't pick the black envelope, even though many people in the audience really urged you strongly to pick the black envelope. This one also has a piece of paper inside, and it says, you will not choose the black envelope. This coupon is worth $1,000. Or, and if you had picked the black envelope, not only would I have paid you $1,000, I'd be walking back to Hollywood. Well, that's very nice. But you didn't pick the black envelope, you didn't pick the red envelope, you picked the blue envelope, you're holding the coupon in your own hands right there. I would like you to come over to the microphone, unfold that coupon, and read out exactly what it says. Please don't change a single word. Read it into the microphone.
You will choose the blue envelope. This coupon is worth 1 round of applause.
Enjoy your prize as much as I did. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much. Good night.
Maven and Christina Linhardt. What a great show! What a great show! Thank you, welcome to. Thank you so much for coming.